you have got to preserve cash and you got to pivot when you've got to pivot.
Okay, welcome back to the Marketing Playbook presented by Details Interactive. Here you'll take away 3 game-winning marketing plays every episode to take back to your team. I'm your host, Mark Friedman, and my career has been focused on direct-to-consumer marketing, direct mail, physical retail, and digital commerce. This is episode number 27, and today's guest is Sucharita Kodali. Before we get started, a quick thank you as always to Max Brandstetter of the Wild Business Growth Podcast for producing this episode. You can reach him at max@maxpodcasting.com to help bring your podcast to life. Let's open the playbook. Ready, break. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Marketing Playbook podcast. Today, I'm joined by Sucharita Kodali, who works for Forrester Research and is the principal analyst serving e-business and channel strategy professionals. We're going to hear about what brought Sucharita to a career in research and her views on this crazy year of 2020 and what she sees for 2021 and beyond with respect to online and retail commerce. This is going to be the last show of 2020, my first year doing the podcast, and I hope that the listeners found the guests and the information interesting. We'll be back in early 2021 to continue the podcast. Sucharita, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Well, I'm glad that you're able to make some time. I appreciate it. I know that for somebody that's focused on e-tail and retail, this is a busy time of the year. So thank you for doing it. Always like to get the first story from people that I talk to on the show. Just a little bit about how you grew up, how perhaps that upbringing had something to do with the career you wound up taking on.
Good question. I don't know that my upbringing, necessarily led to where I am now. If if anything, my upbringing would have led me to go be a doctor, because that's what all Indian children usually grow up to be. But in my case, I think I just was terrible at science when I was when I was younger. So maybe that was probably the single biggest driver of where I ended up where I am now. And I tended to be better at the quant part of kind of any type of studies. I was better probably at math than I was definitely at the sciences. So I ended up studying economics when I was in college, and that took me down. Usually when people major in economics, they just go get jobs usually at some firm after graduation. So, and that's what I did. I took a job at a company, and it happened to be a large U.S. company. It was Disney, and that just kind of took me down this path of consumer-facing businesses. And I don't know that I consciously wanted to ever end up in retail. I didn't have an aversion to it. I just didn't know anything about it. But what did happen was the internet boom, the first internet boom in the late 90s, the one that begat Amazon, eBay, and all of that generation of companies. A lot of those entrepreneurs, not the ones that became the superstars, but there were a whole bunch of other companies that raised money, and that I happened to be in the orbits of some of those entrepreneurs, because a lot of them came out of Disney. They I just happened to have graduated from college around that time, and kind of landed in one of those e-commerce companies, and that took me down the path of retail, and I liked it, and it came naturally to me. I think that's something that I think is important when people make decisions about their career in general, is that you have to pick the combination of what do you like with what are you good at, and for me that was retail.
Oh, that's really interesting. So Harvard economics, and then your first job was Disney. So in what kind of a role, were they hiring, economics majors from Harvard?
They had a division called the Strategic Planning Group, and it was a bunch of ex-consultants and bankers that were in that role. It was, at that time, Disney, the CEO was Michael Eisner, and he had a strategic planning function, and that strategic planning function wrote the 5-year plan, which was an annual process, but it also was entrusted with any major strategic decisions for the company, just thinking through innovation strategies and what came next, as well as mergers and acquisitions. Literally, I think within 1 month of my joining, they'd closed the ABC Cap Cities acquisition, which was one of the biggest acquisitions I think ever in business history up until that time. So a large part of my time there was kind of working on projects that involved the integration of those properties. And one of the biggest properties that was part of that acquisition was ESPN. So the kinds of things that group worked on was launching the ESPN magazine, and kind of having some kind of a experiment around, kind of, if you imagined ESPN as a Chuck E. Cheese for grownups, what would it look like? So, those kinds of things.
Yeah, that must have been a really fun kind of an environment and experience. So that's great. And so you had quite a bit of time at Disney. Ultimately, you made your way to Saks, and tell us about the role there.
Yes, so that was at a point in the company's history. That was in the early 2000s. So, and just to kind of frame that timing, so we are, kind of after the first .com crash. You're kind of, it's Google is around, but Facebook is just being born. Time period where people were still investing in things like the MSN shopping channel, and I think I still had a kind of I had an AOL contract, an AOL shopping contract at the time. So that just kind of frames where we are in time. E-commerce for Saks at that time was a small single-digit percent of its sales. It was like 2 or 3%. The stores were still a huge part of everybody's focus. But there was a new CEO when I had joined, and he was a gentleman that actually came from a company called eLuxury. And the reason that's important is that it was one of those first generation 90s experiments that LVMH actually had in e-commerce. And, kind of that was their attempt to understand, kind of how people were buying luxury goods online. But kind of this CEO, was interested in trying to help e-com be as successful as it could be. His belief was that you needed a siloed e-com organization, which is very interesting because, kind of, I think a lot of CEOs subsequent to that have really tried to roll e-com into other parts of their organization. But he just believed that, if you don't have a siloed org, you're not going to get the resources, and you're not going to have the attention from merchants and store operators to do what you need to do to help it thrive. Which is interesting. I mean, it's informed a lot of my thinking around org structures even since then, because kind of it almost suggests that kind of there are times when silos make sense, and there are times when it doesn't make sense. But I think that, kind of given how early the company was and how much it needed, kind of a little bit of space to do its own thing, that was the right decision for that company at that time. There were kind of other issues that also have informed a lot of my insights since then. Saks at that time was 100% filled. E-commerce transactions were filled from, like, I think 3 or 4 different stores, and that was a disaster because they could never find the items, and they had like a 50% return and cancel rate. If anything, it has it gave me a lot of great insight into the importance of kind of really making sure that you had all of those elements of omni-channel and inventory management rock solid, in order to, if you wanted to drive success.
So I'm going to go a little bit out of the way I had thought about this, but you brought up the topic of org. So I'm sure in the role that you have in research today at Forrester, and we'll come back and tee that up. But org is such a very interesting thing because I've been at this a while as well, and I got involved in the e-commerce business through catalog retailers, and in the early 2000s, which you kind of just laid out, it seemed that the way forward was to create these silos. We had a catalog team, we had a web team, and they really weren't thinking about it as customer focused. They were thinking about it, how we were going to ring the sale. Things have changed a lot, but maybe I'm leading the witness here. But do you still find situations where you leave a conversation with a retailer and scratch your head about the org that they have in place to service their channels?
Oh yeah, yes. I mean, there no question about that. And a lot of I just had a conversation the other day with a company where I mean, I didn't even know what their goals were. It just sounded like they just wanted they weren't it was like a power grab where it's kind of how can we just get more autonomy to make decisions, versus what are you trying to achieve, and kind of what's the right way to achieve what you're trying to achieve, and kind of it wasn't even higher sales growth. I mean, it was just kind of how can we have the autonomy to set our own promotions. I mean, it was just a very convoluted approach to to strategy a lot. And I think that's Mark, probably one of the biggest challenges with a lot of companies when I talk to individuals, is that kind of they're not necessarily in a position to ask about they're not in a position to impact the larger company. They may not kind of so a lot of their decisions and a lot of what frames why they're asking questions are about how can I make this better for me, and how do I help myself professionally, versus what's the right decision to help this company. It's an interesting conundrum because I get it, right? I mean, you have to people I mean, everybody's got to look out for themselves, and there are probably only a handful of people who are really in that position to ask the big question of, what's right for the company. And unfortunately, often those people, don't bother asking, or they don't ask the right people.
Yeah, it's still amazing to me that there's still this struggle of how do you structure these businesses to service the customer. But it sounds like you're seeing that. So you had your Saks experience, and then from there I believe you go to Forrester. So I kind of look at being on the brand side for most of my career. I look at the provider side as the dark side. So what pushed you into the dark side?
Interesting you say that. Well, fortunately, I don't see Forrester as the dark side. It's, I couldn't imagine. I've been here for almost 15 years now, and couldn't imagine being anywhere else. It's a unique role where, kind of the provider side that a lot of people may, shy away from, tend to be sales functions. And that if I was in a sales function, I don't know how I would have survived. Where I am now, it's more thought leadership. It's actually probably more of an academia and think tank type of role. So it's different than, I think, your traditional service provider. And the conversations that I tend to have with people are very much about kind of sharing insights and information and having discussions to help them with their strategies. And I don't get involved at all in sales conversations. I think that it would be much more difficult if I were. I don't think I would have. I don't think I would enjoy it nearly as much as I do if I were in those kinds of conversations. But kind of the reason that kind of what Forrester does, and the unique part of the landscape that it occupies, is is one of thought leadership. And it is, I describe it as a combination of academia, as I'd mentioned before, a little bit of consulting, and even a little bit of journalism, because we do a lot of writing and a lot of, storytelling, and a lot of, kind of shaping dialogue and kind of a narrative around different topics. And that's all stuff that's very interesting to me. It's about strategic thinking around what is important or what's not important, or how does a business actually operate, or kind of what's the long-term prognosis for something. I mean, those are the kinds of questions that I enjoy spending time thinking about, and that's the kind of stuff that this job allows me to spend time thinking about.
That's great. Well, I've been reading your work for years, and I've learned so much from the things that you've written and the thought leadership that you've provided. So thank you for all that. So we're recording here, December 10th or so, and the show will go live, sometime next week. We've obviously been sitting here for the last 9 months in the middle of a pandemic. So much has changed from a retail and a e-tail landscape. So maybe take us back to, if you can remember, back to February, March timeframe. Can you remember how you felt back then from a retailer, a retail analyst perspective, and then how things have transpired over the 9 months? What surprised you? Were there some things that came out of this that were positive with so much negativity going on?
Yes, when I think back to February, there was absolutely no sense, or very little sense, that this was going to be permanent. I remember taking a trip to Australia, and I had a concern about whether or not Australia would shut down, and whether or not there were concerns around my coming from the US. But it was absolutely business as usual there at that moment in time. The closest that I saw is I had stopped at a Target on a layover, and there was a notice that you had a limit on the number of antibacterial hand wipes you could buy, but literally that was it. And a lot of the questions that I got, even from journalists at the time, were supply chain related, and it was all about, well, what's going to happen to the supply of inventory in the spring, or what does this potentially mean for Q4 if we have less inventory and you can't place orders with factories now. And that was pretty much the extent of the questions. And then, of course, March happened, and all of the stay-at-home orders started to happen. But things happened so quickly. And I mean, because I remember being invited, I had a speech I had to give in like mid-March, and it was scheduled, I think, for like March 10th or somewhere around that time
Hmm.
frame. And they were not canceling it. They were like, it's going forward. And it wasn't until like literally March 9th that they were like, yeah, maybe we will cancel it, and we'll reschedule it in 6 months. Of course, thinking that, things would blow over by then. So then March happened. And I think that the sentiment, and I think that this will be familiar to everybody listening, but it was that, we were in free fall as an industry. So many industries, every industry that was consumer facing, not just retail, travel, definitely the restaurant industry, anything that was reliant on discretionary purchasing or business travel, was going to be just, hurt in a way that was beyond comprehension. And I remember those initial kind of virtual webinars we did. It was all about, let's not panic. Let's, just get informed as much as we can about, what loans the government is going to give, and what do you need to do to make it through the next few months. And then things started to open up again in the summertime. And to me, I think that, kind of in that time frame from March through May, I remember just being incredibly paranoid about the virus and thinking that, you just don't know where you could get it from. It could come from a package. I remember getting questions from retailers. I got the funniest was from a luxury retailer that was like, if somebody has COVID, and sneezes on, and, kind of a shirt, does that mean we have to get rid of all of our inventory? And, our response was, no, in fact, you should send it all to Forrester. We'll take it. But I mean, there was just such a lack of, and, just complete understanding of what could happen, and, kind of what puts you at risk. And I think that things are, there's a, somewhat more clarity now. But what I will say, Mark, that was the single biggest change is that the sense of utter doom, that this was going to be so catastrophic and we would never recover from it, that existed in March and April, never came to fruition. And, there were far fewer companies that went out of business. There were far fewer players that, just collapsed than we thought and that we speculated. To this day, I'm shocked that as many restaurants are still as open as they are, and I'm shocked that their numbers are not off by like 80 or 90%. Many of them say their numbers are off only by like, 30%. And, they're able to, at least between cutting their staff and, kind of stretching out their PPP loans, they're actually able to kind of pull through this time. So, I mean, companies like JCPenney and Sears are still hanging in there. That's amazing. Kind of, I think that the biggest surprise to me has been the resilience of the industry, and whether that's come through, taking out loans and being frugal and just really penny pinching, or whether it has been because some companies have been smart about how they've pivoted, and they've leaned into digital and curbside pickup, and a strong e-commerce presence. I mean, whatever path that they've taken, it has served to keep them alive. And that is not something that I would have expected, looking out in April.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Are there certain, features and functions that, you feel like have accelerated? You talked about curbside pickup, and I think if you were a retailer that was already doing buy online, pickup in store, you were able to easily pivot relatively easily to a curbside. But if you were one of the retailers that wasn't doing BOPUS, that was almost impossible. So was there? Do you agree with that? I guess first, and then is there something else that you saw people leaning into that is now going to become the norm?
Well, if one did not have curbside pickup, I think that you just saw people trying to figure it out pretty quickly, and it could be that, or kind of online ordering, or that was a significant part of how these companies like Instacart and DoorDash were able to get as much traction, is because even if you don't have the ability to do that, they offered you the ability to offer that to your customers. I mean, it came at a very, it was like, the cost was a pound of flesh, but nonetheless, it helped you check the box and preserve at least some market share. Kind of definitely the whole digital ordering piece had been a significant area of investment. I think I honestly think it remains to be seen how much really sticks. We have some forecasts, and kind of there was an acceleration by a couple of years of kind of what we would have expected maybe by 2023 happened in 2020. So that much will stick. But kind of, we still think that the vast majority of transactions will likely revert back to physical stores, back over time. And not the least of which, especially when you take categories like grocery, the whole digital fulfillment piece is actually very costly, and it's not something that is particularly easy to do. So we are not completely convinced that the supply of those offerings is going to be there, even if the demand may be. But other things that will likely stick will be things like digital payments, any type of contactless payments, remote ordering ahead, or the ability to check ahead. I mean, that's always been an issue with any type of omni-channel, is how accurate is your inventory. That was, the whole issue with Saks early that I'd referred to earlier, is like not
Yep.
having that accurate inventory. And I think that a lot of companies have gotten much further along with fixing those problems. And that is something that once you have it and you're able to preserve it, there's a tremendous amount of value. And it serves the purpose of self-service. So you're not necessarily introducing new costs, that retailers have to absorb. You're just providing more information to customers to help make their shopping experience a little bit easier.
Yeah, it's interesting. DoorDash as an example. They went public yesterday, so they, over the last 9 months, I don't know what their valuation might have been, 9 months ago pre-pandemic, but they parlayed this into a $35 billion valuation at their IPO, and so that's kind of a one thing, and you called out the part about shopping for groceries. My family, we never had used Instacart or any home delivery for food shopping. I don't know why. I mean, mostly just wanting to go and pick out your own produce and pick out your own meat and what have you. And I would say for 9 months we've almost exclusively done that. But I could see us totally going back to the store and never again, if I don't have to, using a home shopping.
Yeah, yeah. I think the jury is still out on a lot of kind of this speculation around how much of the e-commerce and the internet behavior sticks. I mean, if you take a company like Target, their curbside pickup is actually, well, I mean, you see it in their numbers, has been wildly successful, and you can see why. I mean, they don't have any
It's great.
minimum. Yeah, it's
Yep.
great. It's a great service. They're pretty quick about it, at least in my experience.
Yep.
So customers are likely very happy. They have a pretty seamless experience, and they also don't have any minimum order that they forced on you as a customer. So literally, you can go and say, "Go, kind of pull my toothpaste for me," and they will come and they'll bring it out to your car. And so, what is that? That is Nordstrom-like concierge service that they have introduced at Target, which is fantastic for us as customers right now, but not particularly fantastic for Target long term unless they start charging higher prices. So that becomes really the big question, is how are they going to, kind of make that cost effective over time? Or do they cut back on some of those services? Or do they force you to have a minimum transaction value? Or do they lump it into some kind of paid tier offering, like their version of Amazon Prime in the future? Because it's just not sustainable. I mean, there's a reason that, kind of companies like Target have not had concierge offerings up until now. It's just not cost effective.
The devil's in the details. You've probably heard that phrase time and time again in your professional life. Projects get started with great intentions, but you no longer have the time to pay attention to the little things that can make the difference between success and failure. At Details Interactive, you can discuss your business with a seasoned direct-to-consumer marketing executive who has helped launch and grow web businesses and integrate multi-channel marketing initiatives. Learn more at detailsinteractive.com. Maybe we talk a bit about Cyber 5, so the period of time from Thanksgiving through Cyber Monday, and it seems like it got earlier this year. Brands were being more promotional earlier and earlier, and over the years it's extended the Cyber Monday into Cyber Tuesday into Green Monday. So what did you see this year during that very key time for retailers?
Stores were terrible. When you see, and I use data from Placer.ai, which has a lot of the physical store information, and that was not unexpected because every store was trying to avoid having crowds in its inside. So all of those numbers were down and kind of catastrophically off of last year's numbers. Now, did e-commerce make up some of that delta? To some degree, but e-commerce is still a minority of transactions. And I mean, even during the holiday season, it's usually not going to be more than 30%. And if that 30% is still only growing at like 20 or 30% year over year, which is what some of the data points suggested that the industry shook out as, and if your stores, which are the majority of that revenue, are down by like 50 to 80%, you're still going to be off. You're not going to see a net positive time frame. And that's why we did start. I think that a lot of people anticipated that, they weren't going to have a great Thanksgiving weekend or series of days subsequent to Thanksgiving. So that's why you saw the pushes to try to bring as much sale forward into October as possible. Or you saw, 3 weeks of Black Friday specials through every weekend in November for some retailers. Did it actually drive very much? The data points that we saw suggested that it did not. And as much as retailers were trying to pull sales forward, the consumer wasn't necessarily responding. That kind of tells you where it is. And now that said, e-com, kind of for what it is trending up. It is positive. You've heard all of these stories about, the carriers having more volume than ever before and being later than they've ever been before. I feel like that's a narrative that we hear every year. And, if anything, there's less pressure to deliver on time this year, because it's not like people are going to be having these massive holiday get-togethers like they have in the past. So there's a little bit more of the flexibility from that standpoint, to kind of get things to people when kind of at the pace that may be appropriate for the carrier to get it to somebody.
Yeah, the carriers were signaling, 6 weeks ago, and unlike any time in the past, I think you saw many retailers online, putting notices up, order early. Our shippers are telling us they're not going to be able to meet demand, so maybe that pulled up some business as well. So before we get into 2021 and your view into the future, I did have one question. People come to you for your thought leadership. How do you deal with all the concept of the shiny new object? I'm an e-commerce guy. I get called on by tons and tons of new providers that are out there with new things. How do you counsel people like me on what to think seriously about and what to pass on?
Yeah, that is something that we spend a lot of time trying to dig into, and a lot of our time is spent demystifying, those bright shiny objects, and trying to differentiate between what could be meaningful and what may just be hype. And a lot of it, comes down to having lots of different conversations with people throughout the ecosystem. It's the service providers, it's the people who've built the technology, it's people who have implemented the technology, and a lot, and we have, one of the advantages that we have is we do have a trusted network of people that we can often call on and get their points of view and get their perspectives on things as well, and that helps to kind of shape a conclusion, because you're absolutely right. A lot of times you will see something from a technologist, and it's hard, it's hard to not be seduced by the message, and for a period of time, the biggest, kind of, I guess Casanovas of retail would be like, the Googles and the Amazons, because every week they'd come up with something new, and everybody in retail would, just be all, just so deferential and believing of this technology that they've now released is going to forever change the world and whatnot. And, what we do is we spend a lot of time tracking these technologies very closely, after their launches, kind of years after their launches. And we see, what's the consumer adoption been, or what has the retailer adoption been? And, of the retailers that have tried something, what has been the impact, and what have been the lessons that these companies have learned? And I think that when technology innovation, kind of when all of this was new, like, in the early 2000s, it was a lot harder to, dispel myths. But now that there has been, like, a decade and a half of enough experiments where you've seen things and people have told you stories that, kind of only ended up biting people in the hide later on, there's more, I think, of a willingness to be skeptical. And, kind of the skepticism is not as novel as maybe, it was like 20 years ago, where if you were skeptical, like you were just a Luddite who didn't, understand technology or appreciate it. Now I think that there's, kind of a little bit more of a circumspect approach, and it's like, eye rolling around, yeah, whatever, this is, another crazy experiment by Amazon or whoever.
Right. Yeah. And so now, thinking into, 2021, what are you seeing, where there's a vaccine hopefully on the way, maybe it doesn't get, completely rolled out till late spring, middle of the year. What are you counseling, your retail clients about for this coming year?
Well, I don't know that there is any easy answer. And a lot of what we saw through much of 2020 will likely continue through much of 2021. There was a great article that was recently in the Wall Street Journal about a little mochi shop in Japan that is one of, I think, a handful of businesses in the world that's more than 1,000 years old. It is just fascinating because it was a fascinating article, and I encourage everyone to try to go get their hands. I think it was the Journal, it may have been the New York Times, but anyway, if you kind of Google, Mushi Shop Japan 1,000 years old, you'll find it. And but the key takeaways of that were, you have got to preserve cash and you got to pivot when you've got to pivot. And I think that those are two really, really valuable pieces of advice even now, which is you just got to get through this storm. This is, an awful period in history, and this will be something that our children are going to look back on as, kind of just a life-changing moment in their lives. But you've got to preserve cash, and you've just got to do what you need to do to get through this. And then if it is important to completely transform your business because you see that the demand for your product may not be there long term, you have to figure out how you're going to change and transform either your products or your service offerings in order to be something that resonates more. That's really it. I mean, I don't see things getting better in 2021. I wouldn't bet on some great aid package coming to anybody's rescue in 2021. It's you've got to figure out how you are going to make it through yourself, and kind of hope that your customers are there with you in that journey forward.
Yeah, that's great. Preserve cash and pivot. There you go. Well, we're down to the end of the time. This is a great conversation. Sucharita, where can people reach out to you on social media if they would like to connect?
Yeah, I tend to be on Twitter and LinkedIn, and my Twitter handle is smulperu. So that's my maiden name, but SMULPURU. And on LinkedIn, it's my married name, which is Sucharita Kodali. So either of those are usually where I'm commenting on something almost every day.
Well, that's great. I urge everybody to follow along, because I think you'll get great information and learn a lot about the industry. So anyway, have a happy holiday, happy New Year. Thank you, and I wish everybody and your family good health.
Thank you, Mark. The same to you.
That's it. Today's game ball goes to Sucharita Kodali for coming on the Marketing Playbook. Her insights on this past year and her outlook for 2021 were very interesting. I hope that you're able to take away some thought-provoking concepts for the new year. Thank you, Playbook marketers, for listening to another episode. If you want to check out more pages of the Marketing Playbook, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast spot and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter at Details Interact and learn more at detailsinteractive.com. Until next time, the devil's in the details.